Thank you. Good, thanks. Seth, perhaps.
So I have, looks like I have 6 different points to answer from the 3 speakers, and thank you all of you for your questions. First, not to disagree with the first speaker, I may sound like an evangelist, but the book actually is anything but simple. I'm trying to provide a framework of concepts and basically saying over and over again, context matters. Context matters. Every country is different. We have to be practical in how we deal with the problems. What I am trying to do is address some big picture structural issues and that I think are often missed because we really jump to the formal. And for me, the problem is the pre-formal or the informal institutions or in the software. And in that sense, I am an evangelist because I think that is the key issue, and we can't change the formal without addressing the informal. So then there was a question about why development aid doesn't change. I think I think that's relatively simple to answer. There are the same way countries have a hard time changing because of their institutions and their incentives. The aid business has incentives and institutions, and I haven't seen anyone do a great analysis. I've seen bits of that, but in my book, aid is not a high priority in my book. I have 14 chapters, and foreign aid is chapter 13. And I did that on purpose, that the main policy chapters, which begin at 6, are focused on elites within countries. I don't know if elites are going to pick up my book. It's easier to come to Brussels and talk to people in Brussels than to go to Lagos and get people in Lagos to come in. Here, I'm going to hand out copies of my books to all the people who live on VI, Victoria Island, and have them go home and change their business practices, what have you. But I think the real reason aid has a problem because there really are built-in incentives. And one example of that is USAID, which does some things very well, but used to spend a lot more money on like universities and other long-term development programs, and now it spends 40% of its money on healthcare. Now, healthcare is a good thing, but it's also the easiest thing to justify. We vaccinate. I can go back and say, we took this money, we vaccinated this many children, give me the budget next year. And I think really the role, and I agree with the second part of your question, how relevant is aid? Aid actually is less and less relevant. Depends on the country, of course. Some countries, the national budget is whatever percent still aid, and if you're 75% of your government budget is aid is extremely relevant for that country. If you're down much lower than that, it's less relevant. But I tell you where aid should be relevant and where it's not is dealing with some of the long-term structural ecosystem questions. I think this is a failure of imagination and too much a focus on the micro justifiable things. It's harder to justify building a law school. But I would say there's, especially if the country is a certain size in terms of its scale. I mean, you're not going to build a law school. It won't be your first priority in a country of 5 million people. But if you have tens of millions of people, you have a reasonably large country, why does nobody build a law school? Why does nobody build a business school? Why does nobody build a governance academy? Many years ago, USAID put money out. This is an example. Actually built one of the better, or contributed to building one of the better engineering and agricultural schools in India. But we don't do that anymore. And why don't we spend more money having partnerships with institutions so we actually work with them? This is an idea from Paul Farmer, if you know him, the famous doctor who works in Haiti, from Harvard, about he worked with different institutions as in a horizontal partnership and tried to help them build up their systems so they were more capable. And I have some creative ideas how that might take place. So why don't we focus on some? This I really think is the future of aid. If aid wants to matter, when there's already China and there's already growth and is trying to do these long-term developmental ecosystem issues, that can, not quickly, but over time, begin to change a certain momentum within the system. And I think that is something that it's against the incentives and institutions of aid, but it really should be what people, visionary leaders, step up and to do. And just one more point, you mentioned why nations fail. I happen to disagree with this book. It talks about inclusiveness in a very different way than I do. It looks at inclusiveness through a very Western frame. Inclusiveness is only brought about because you do what we in the West do in terms of how we build our institutions. And I think that is a logical thing to think about when a country is at a certain development stage. But I'm looking much further along the continuum in terms of where countries are. And I think if you're going to build inclusiveness in most of the less developed world, you're not going to do it by following a Western model. There's many other, the Western model is part of it, but there's a lot of other things we have to leverage to do that. Okay, so the last, I think there was two big issues that I want to comment on from our last speaker. I don't want to speak about Sanusi. We will leave, I'm not as well informed, so I will not comment on that. Globalization. Globalization is a great force for change. Is it a positive force or a negative force is very much dependent upon the nature of the state. I think you brought that issue up. I agree completely. Globalization has been enormously empowering for East Asia. It has been enormously destructive for many African countries because it brings in incentives from from drug trade, think about some of the West African countries, how they're affected by the drug trade, from financial flows, from being able to exploit mineral sites in Eastern Congo and export in different militias to export them. All these are products of globalization. If you have a state or public authority, if I may broaden it beyond this, if you have public authority that can act as a constructive means for a country or a society, then you are able to leverage globalization. If you're not, it can be negative. And so I think it's like a technology. It's like another technology. And how is a country, this is why the state is so important. In urban, rural, I actually think what you say and what I say are not against each other. I have a chapter on empowering the poor. And one of the things I talk about come from this tracking development report is that governments should spend 10% of their public money, of their funds, on the rural area. You're not going to have manufacturing take off if you don't start with the rural sector. I agree with this completely. I'm mainly talking about how the incentives for leaders might change. I'm not saying we should focus on the rural area. I think these are two parallel issues, and I don't mean to say anything else. I'm just thinking if we're going to have trouble fixing the DRC, maybe we can make Congo and a couple of other cities more effective and work from there. And I'm not against the rural area at all. And in East Asia, for sure, Indonesia and everything, the rural area is very important. More questions?
Yes, indeed. I have James, I have you, sir, and I have a third question over there. Melanie, you wanted to chip in as well? Yes, Jim.
Well, thank you very much for Seth Kaplan. I wanted to pick you up on the where do you go from here in terms of the policy implications of your thinking. I'd like to focus in particularly on this question of your first description of greater horizontal social cohesion. Now, I think that's fair enough. I mean, I take the proposition, but actually constructing greater social cohesion is not easy. We can't all go back to wait for 2,000 years to get our institutions as the Chinese are. And I think in some ways, the problem is precisely that we're moving to a world of greater diversity and less social cohesion. And the Chinese are finding that too. In fact, and that's one of the most troubling, the things that troubles them most. Now, one of your prescriptions is, say, let's start with the level of the city, and cities are easier to fix than states. I think there are, well, I can certainly pick out a few cities which have worked well, but there are also a lot of cities which don't work so well. And I really wonder, is this solution of going to a smaller scale, are we going back to a small is beautiful sort of idea? Is that what you're saying? Okay, some of the cities you talk about are not small, but But still, they are small and relative to states, and it seems to me that's why you're suggesting we work. So I agree with this central proposition, social cohesion helps, but I don't see where your ideas are taking us in terms of constructing social cohesion, except in these small scale actions. And maybe that's your idea. I mean, that the more small scale social actions you have, you bring the professional associations together, you get trade unions to chip in, and you fix this city, you fix that district. Maybe that's the solution, but I'm interested in your development.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Victor Toko. Victor Toko. I do appreciate your presentation. Thank you very much. I did not catch really the rationale behind the comparison of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, specifically between Nigeria and Babu. Because we have to know that these two gentlemen came to power in two different contexts, in terms of politics, economic, external influence, etc., etc. So, I don't know, you have to compare two things which are comparable. So, I don't see exactly the point you wanted to make. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Jan?
Thanks very much for your presentation and very stimulating in terms of food for thought. Sometimes you come to seminars with good presentations and you really hope for learning more, but also sometimes you feel a little bit disconnected from what has been presented, and you hesitate between constructive comments, but also damage control in a way vis-à-vis certain audiences, particularly in Europe, I would say. I think what you presented in Europe may resonate, in particular in some communities of expertise, like universities or also development experts. It may resonate as something which is a little bit away from current work that is being done today. I have 4 points. The first one is on your approach in terms of comparison, the use of China as the example or the model that you use to then compare with the possible development of fragile states. I'm not sure I understand or agree with your definition of inclusiveness in the case of China, and probably you didn't have enough time to dwell into the details of it. But I do have issues with China being presented as an inclusive model. So I would appreciate maybe some more elaboration on that. I'm pretty sure that comments on these parts of the book will feed you with enough material to write a second book on China alone. So how do you measure inclusiveness, and how can you be more precise? The second point is about the attitude you have regarding the fixing solution. For me, this is a bit of a problem. I think phrasing development questions as just a fixing question is indeed a bit dangerous, especially vis-à-vis certain audiences who are working hard on a daily basis to improve their governance environments, their social context, and so on. So I would encourage you maybe to reflect on the usage of certain words. The third big question I had was about something I missed very much in your presentation, which is about the international dimension of state fragility. I'm not speaking of my reservations about the very concept of state fragility, that's something else. I miss, the international connections. I miss the examples of elites being internationalized already, connected with each other, being part of a certain international social class, actually. So maybe even to provoke you a little bit, to inject a bit of Marxist analysis in terms of the social classes confrontation, maybe would enrich the wealth of your thoughts on state fragility. But international dimensions are also related to not only the role of development agencies, but also of diplomacy, of individuals. And I had the impression that sometimes you looked at some fragile states in isolation. So maybe you may want to rebalance that. I mean, you asked for examples of experiences in perhaps fragile countries. I worked in Haiti, I worked on Chad, I worked in Georgia, which at some point also have been described as a fragile state. I worked on the former Soviet Union. So I hardly recognize my experience as a former, for instance, crisis group senior analyst on the ground, interviewing elites on a daily basis. I don't recognize myself in a lot of what you presented. So I would be very interested in keeping in touch and going on dialoguing about context. And my final point would be very much about the presentation itself, especially if you do it again in Europe. I would really recommend you to really focus on the context. You said, your book keeps on repeating that the context matters. Well, if context matters, do speak and focus on context. And engage your audiences on specific contexts in order to test your assumptions and see if they fly or not. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
One more question.
Yeah, I was just, do you want to ask something as well?
Yes.
Is it okay, Melanie, if I take you in the third round, because I know that some people have to leave, and then we go into a third round, and I will allow you the time to get responses.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you, Seth, for a comprehensive presentation. I see some of the reactions.
In my opinion, never focuses on why China works. China is like the big elephant in the room in the development field. This is the most successful developing countries. Imagine a country the scale of China, 1.2, 1.3 billion people, a huge territory, and it actually works pretty well. And it's accomplished an enormous amount of things in the last 35 years, since 78, 79, when the reforms began. We never asked, why has China worked so well, and what can we learn from it? I have a class I teach about what we can learn from China on economic transformation. And for me, I mean, this is a 13-week class, so I want to give you a couple of very quick ideas, but China has succeeded despite the fact that it arguably has a bigger challenge than most of the developing world, because the scale of the country is enormous, and it's also, in some ways, an extremely diverse country. So these are what I would consider some fundamental points. It is more homogeneous than most of the developing world, at least out of East Asia. It is a unified state. The communism, generally we don't think that communism is a positive issue, and there's a lot of downsides to communism, but to the sense that it's an ideology that is bigger than identities, ethnic, religious, whatever identities, it's an ideology that can drive an agenda. It is somewhat pro-development. Even the Soviet Union tried, to a certain extent, to be very developmental, and it is actually very inclusive. So there are elements of this which I think are positive. Also, it had a party that actually won the war, and this party is extremely institutionalized. One of the missing elements in most of the developing world is that there's no highly institutionalized political parties. It's usually a family, or think about India, think about Bangladesh, think about most African political parties. It's around ethnicity, it's around individuals, it's around families. These are not highly institutionalized political parties. So what you have in Africa, you often have a period of time when a country is relatively developmental, and as soon as the person leaves the room, he gets old or he passes away, we're back to non-developmental politics. So the question is here, it's 85 million or something like that members in China. This is a party that's very institutionalized, decently meritocratic. Anybody can go up. It's changing as the country gets further along. This institution becomes less effective, but compared to most of the developing world, it is a very institutionalized mechanism for managing power. And also, it's a very institutionalized mechanism for promoting development on many levels. Traditional Chinese teaching has been very important. You have to be a moral leader. The government. So these are very important reasons why China is inclusive. It's a homogeneous country, at least in the core of China. It's mainly one ethnic group. This long history has mattered tremendously. Ideas matter a lot. I think the communist ideas mattered a lot. The nationalism ideas mattered a lot. The neighborhood effect, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, all these countries had developed this nationalistic developmental state ideology, and China absorbed it. But also you have traditional teaching. You have many, many reasons why the leaders of China feel a very, very strong burden to be developmental. Yes, as they get richer, their institutions are working less and less effective, and they have problems coming that they cannot solve the way they're working now. But to go from very poor to where they are now, it's a great accomplishment, and I think a lot of these issues need to be understood. Everybody probably knows that China has brought more people out of poverty than anyone else in the world. In fact, until roughly this date, China has brought more people out of poverty than the world. The world was a minus compared to China was a plus about 600 million. The last 6-7 years, the rest of the world has become a big positive. But I mean, this accomplishment is without parallel. So here's something about the differences between elites. Developmental states, I think China is a great example, but many East Asian countries are like this, relatively homogeneous. They have a common identity, a system of managing power that is a rules that everybody buys into. Even if you don't 100% agree with it, everybody buys into it, and you don't have these multiple competing rule systems, which is typical of most of the developing world. There is not a strong rule system in most African countries. It's just competing systems and everybody trying to get power, and there's no bringing together of elites. The elites are fighting. Whoever gets that power is taking the money into their pocket. There's an ideology, and the population is seen as a resource. In most poor countries, the population is an obstacle to the goals of the elite. In most of East Asia, the population is a resource because the richer the population is, the more honor, in essence, I get as a leader. I am empowering people because it's bringing up the state, and I'm performing a historic role to my country. This idea of people's historic or their responsibility, their obligation, completely different than the moral obligation of leaders in most of the developing world. Here's another example from the Tracking Development report that was completed not so long ago. Another idea that matters. What is economic transformation? The ideas in Asia are completely different than the ideas in Africa. In Asia, it's about gradually building on the institutions and capacities we have. Incremental improvements. In Africa, or even in many other parts of the developing world, it's very much about let's build this modern factory, let's build this huge complex. These ideas are very different. I think the Middle East is in some ways very similar. We don't compare the Middle East and Africa very often, but in essence, the Middle East has many of the exclusionary problems, and their ideas of economic transformation are also much more similar to Africa than to East Asia. So this is what I would call a very important understanding. If the elites in Africa would understand development like Asia, maybe they would emphasize different things. This is maybe more controversial. I'm discussing here that a question ought to be asked, why did the Middle East have among the best development outcomes pre-Arab Spring of any part in the world? And I think the leaders were autocratic, they were exclusionary in many ways, and this brought on the Arab Spring. But another source of the Arab Spring is that the leaders actually were, in some ways, very pro-poor. They felt a moral obligation to the poor, and this produced incredible outcomes. The World Bank, I believe it is, has a report from October 2010 about the North Africa miracle. This is 1 or 2 months before the Arab Spring began, because they have produced incredible human development results. This, I'm only saying, it's a different concept of your role as a leader. And therefore, they did not share power, but they invested in the poor, which improved their lives a lot. And most other autocratic leaders did not. And it's a question why. Again, here is 2 people that I think are very similar example. Jerry Rawlings, who is wrote the foreword for this book, a person I admire a lot, and I had a chance to know him and his wife. So I says, Jerry, you need to do this, and he's a really down-to-earth guy. And he's a very special person for me. I don't think he receives the recognition that he maybe ought to. He came to Ghana and does not have a great education background. You talk to him, you think he's like a mechanic from down the street. You don't think of him as a special, that he was the head of a country for 22 years. He came to power not once, but twice in coups, transformed his country. He was very leftist views, but he introduced some very powerful economic reforms. He decentralized power. He tried to make the country much more inclusive, brought in democracy, ran twice, won, and then retired at a relatively young age. I cannot find another example. And here's his neighbor from Cote d'Ivoire, much better education, a history professor, degree in France, and he brought, this used to be the most successful country in Africa, at least economically, from the 60s and 70s. And he brought on a very bad civil war, excluded the people from the north. So what is it that motivated these people to act so differently? I think this is a very important question that should be understood. Of course, the social political dynamics are easier in Ghana than Cote d'Ivoire, but he had, in some ways, a much stronger base than Ghana had. Ghana was going downhill for 25 years. So why do these people act differently? So for me, if we're in a country and we're trying to foster change, we have to look at incentives. And leaders are everywhere in a country. Social, political, civil, economic leaders. And my book is really trying to give lots and lots of practical things that can create a more inclusive society. I give you some here. I won't go through these in great detail. They're on your handout. But these are smaller steps that you can make that can, over time, begin to change dynamics. How do you create more inclusive, encompassing, non-governmental institutions, governmental institutions, attitudes, mechanisms that will change the way elites behave? And I believe countries have elites everywhere, have elites and leaders potentially everywhere. Even though the elites are a small part of the population, they have the education, they have the resources, they have the connections that can make change. And the question is, can we get enough of them to make these changes so that society over time will have a more substantial change? Second big idea, which I'll run through quickly, is an idea that cities can save states. Again, I'm trying to think of what can we do that will change the incentives and the way people behave. And I really believe in most fragile states, it is much easier to fix a city. I hate to use the word fix, because we're not here to fix things, but it's much easier to make a city have good incentives than a country. And I'm thinking and here's some reasons why, and I'm thinking about my experience in Lagos, which the next slide we'll talk about. A city does not have the political geography, the problems of projection of they're more likely to do something for the authority. The ethnic, religious divisions that states have, and lead poor than if the poor live 1,000 miles away. If the poor are 1,000 miles away, there's very little incentive for the elites to do anything about the poor. And actually, in a city, you actually can create a strong tax base. Very few fragile states have good tax bases. land taxes and things like that, or sales taxes, but mostly land taxes could create a local income source. So I believe the net result of these things is that cities can have better political incentives for elites. I'm not guaranteeing they will, but they can if enough of the right things are in place. It's easier to make Kinshasa work than it is to make the Congo work, is a very simple example. Lagos now, in the last 14, 15 years, it's not Brussels, it's not The Hague, it's not Paris, but it has made enormous progress. It's had two great leaders. It's been the first time they've had democracy for a period of time. And because the Nigerian political system decentralizes a lot of power, it is unique. There's very, very few developing countries that decentralize a lot of power from the central government. In many cases, all the money and power is in the hands of the central government, and even more the president and the executive branch. Because of the Civil War, it was empowered, and now 75% versus 20% of the money is based upon local revenue, and that changes things a lot. Colombia is another great example. Bogota and Medellin have been transformed since the '91 Constitution. Look at that violence since the early '90s. Have very famous mayors in these cities. The Philippines is another example of a very visionary mayor. This is not going to work 10 times out of 10, but I believe it's a path to begin to change the political processes in these countries. And urbanization is playing an increasingly important role. It's over half the world population. It will be over 60% of the developing world population by 2050. So making cities work is very important, and it's very important for fragile states. These are places in China, by the way. You do not have slums in China. It's among the only developing countries in the world without large slums. They manage it in somewhat illiberal fashion, but they focus very much on using urbanization to promote development and to promote good outcomes for their population in a way that I think very few countries have done. Vietnam is one of the few other examples. Compare that to India. If you've ever been in an Indian city or an African city, or even in some parts of the Middle East, the nature of, go to the outskirts of Karachi, walk the streets of Mumbai, go to, I think it's Kibera in Nairobi, all these places. You don't have these places when a country manages urbanization for its benefit. So the thing is, these are steps that could make cities more empowered, and I think they're places that you can get good governance or better governance when you can't at the country level. And then the goal would be to try to devolve power, increase capacity, increase taxation, increase accountability mechanisms. These countries really need more tax money. And the goal would be to transform countries by how you transform cities, and slowly use that to transform the politics of countries. And I think that is an idea that I have not heard anyone else make, and what I call urban-based governance. And again, just to conclude, is that the real point of development, or the real point if we're trying to help countries or if we are in countries, it's not about us outside. It's really about development. Is about people having the capacity to manage their own affairs, use their own governance and other resources, creating institutions that can bring people together from different backgrounds. If you don't create encompassing institutions, again, the horizontal across society and the governmental, these countries have what might be called collection action problems, as David Booth from ODI has referred them to. You need to somehow create an ecosystem so they can solve their own problems. One idea is institutional accompaniment, partnering institutions. The thing is, we have to create a bottom-up, inside-out capacity ecosystem that countries can manage their own affairs and empower them so that we are no longer needed. And you have to be very pragmatic, and that means look everywhere for good ideas. And this is what Jerry Rawlings, I hate to put a last slide or second to last slide to sell my book, but I have to pay the bills, so I just throw that in there, so forgive me. That's Jerry Rawlings, who I admire a lot. And if you want to follow me, you can follow me on my website or my other communication mechanisms. And thank you very much for coming today.
Well, thanks a lot, Seth. Also because you managed to stick within the time. In fact, you reduced the time of speaking, which allows us to engage. We would suggest that this is the moment where you can ask questions. What I would like to do very basically is to facilitate between you and Seth, for as much as that is possible. My name is Jan van Heukelom. I work at ECDPM and do political economy. So I try to bring in politics in the thinking about development. And certainly I am pleased to say a little word about betrayed. Allow Seth to say a bit more why he chose that title, who is betraying whom, but I have a hunch. What I liked very much about the book is that it was in one way comforting. For example, it referred to one of the best insights on what it is to be poor from the World Bank, by the way. This Voices of the Poor that he mentioned. I'm not referring to the recommendations, policy recommendations for donors or international development institutions, but certainly the kind of insight it gives on what is poverty. Very good. I also appreciated the book because it tells me things that I wasn't aware of at all. I knew Jerry Rawlings, but now I know why I have to appreciate him better for what he still is. I had some prejudices about him, so thanks, Seth, you set that straight. And then I also think, and this is just as a way of plowing back one strand of thinking, because I had the opportunity to go through the book a little bit and to allow you to benefit as much as possible from Seth's insights. What I appreciated a lot was in his book, he addresses, yes, issues of incentives, the nature of the state-elite relations, and the importance of understanding elite behavior without thinking you can't do anything with them. So there's a more nuanced thinking about elites, but also about the relation between businesses, private sector, and elites, and how that affects what Seth probably would call structural features in which then development comes about or doesn't. And so for those reasons, I think it adds a lot of value to probably some of the questions that you've been trying to solve from your various practices. What I would suggest is then, when you introduce your question, just state who you are, where you come from, because that also, I think, is very rich in the book. That is an emphasis on context specificity. Seth has an experience of 60 countries. I have about 5. Let me share with you one, that's South Africa. It colors my appreciation about how quickly political change can come about, how slow it takes to develop. And I think it's helpful to have a more informed debate if we just briefly state what our experiences are, and that makes it also easier, I guess, for Seth to respond to it. So, without further ado, this is your floor, this is your opportunity, and we welcome any questions that you may have. Yes, please.
If I may pick up Jeremy Lester, you'll see on the list of participants, there's nothing against it. I'm nobody that. But I started off with development some 40 years ago when I was told that Japan was the model that we should follow and study in order to know what development is. I admire you, sir, particularly your name, Seth Kaplan. You sound like a born-again Christian. In the sense that you are an evangelist, you have a simple, clear message, and that's wonderful. I've worked with so many different countries in so many different situations. And I think we've got to do an awful lot of deconstruction of what is the state, what is the development you're talking about, what is an elite. But let me leave that aside because we're going to move lots of it. I just want to say I admire such a nice, simplistic, clear view, but it's very comforting if you can do it.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Catherine Mullard from the European Peace Building Liaison Office. It's a network of organisations working on peace and conflict issues. Thank you. I found a very persuasive analysis. And I think you're building very much on other recent work, such as World Development Report in 2011, Why Nations Fail, what ODI...
That is a logical thing to think about when a country is at a certain development stage. But I'm looking much further along the continuum in terms of where countries are. And I think if you're going to build inclusiveness in most of the less developed world, you're not going to do it by following a Western model. There's many other, the Western model is part of it, but there's a lot of other things we have to leverage to do that. Okay, so the last, I think there was two big issues that I want to comment on from our last speaker. I don't want to speak about Sanusi. We will leave, I'm not as well informed, so I will not comment on that. Globalization. Globalization is a great force for change. Is it a positive force or a negative force is very much dependent upon the nature of the state. I think you brought that issue up. I agree completely. Globalization has been enormously empowering for East Asia. It has been enormously destructive for many African countries because it brings in incentives from international, from drug trade, think about some of the West African countries, how they're affected by the drug trade, from financial flows, from being able to exploit mineral sites in eastern Congo and export in different militias to export them. All these are products of globalization. If you have a state or public authority, if I may broaden it beyond this, if you have public authority that can act as a constructive means for a country or a society, then you are able to leverage globalization. If you're not, it can be negative. And so I think it's like a technology. It's like another technology. And how is a country, this is why the state is so important. And urban, rural, I actually think what you say and what I say are not against each other. I have a chapter on empowering the poor. And one of the things I talk about come from this tracking development report is that governments should spend 10% of their public money, of their funds, on the rural area. You're not going to have manufacturing take off if you don't start with the rural sector. I agree with this completely. I'm mainly talking about how the incentives for leaders might change. I'm not saying we should focus on the rural area. I think these are two parallel issues, and I don't mean to say anything else. I'm just thinking if we're going to have trouble fixing the DRC, maybe we can make Congo and a couple of other cities more effective and work from there. And I'm not against the rural area at all. And in East Asia, for sure, Indonesia and everything, the rural area was very important. More questions?
Yes, indeed. I have James, I have you, sir, and I have a third question over there. Melanie, you wanted to chip in as well? Oh. Yes, please.
Well, thank you very much for Seth Kaplan. I wanted to pick you up on where you go from here in terms of the policy implications of your thinking. I'd like to focus in particularly on this question of your first description of greater horizontal social cohesion. Now, I think that's fair enough. I mean, I take the proposition, but actually constructing greater social cohesion is not easy. We can't all go back to wait for 2,000 years to get our institutions into the shape the Chinese are. And I think in some ways, the problem is precisely that we're moving to a world of greater diversity and less social cohesion. And the Chinese are finding that too. In fact, and that's one of the most troubling, the things that troubles them most. Now, one of your prescriptions is, say, let's start with the level of the city, and cities are easier to fix than states. I think there are, well, I can certainly pick out a few cities which have worked well, but there are also a lot of cities which don't work so well. And I really wonder, is this solution of going to a smaller scale, are we going back to a small is beautiful sort of idea? Is that what you're saying? Okay, some of the cities you talk about are not small, but still they are small in relative to states, and it seems to me that's why you're suggesting we work. So I agree with this central proposition, social cohesion helps, but I don't see where your ideas are taking us in terms of constructing social cohesion, except in these small scale actions. And maybe that's your idea. I mean, that the more small scale social actions you have, you bring the professional associations together, you get trade unions to chip in, and you fix this city, you fix that district. Maybe that's the solution, but I'd be interested in you developing.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Victor Toko. I do appreciate your presentation. Thank you very much. I did not catch really the rationale behind the comparison of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, specifically between generally and Babu. Because we have to know that these two gentlemen came to power in two different contexts, in terms of politics, economic, external influence, etc., etc. So I don't know. You have to compare two things which are comparable. So I don't see exactly the point you wanted to make. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Gentlemen?
Thanks very much for your presentation and very stimulating and food for thought. Sometimes you come to seminars with good presentations and you really hope for learning more, but also sometimes you feel a little bit disconnected from what has been presented, and you hesitate between constructive comments, but also damage control in a way vis-à-vis certain audiences, particularly in Europe, I would say. I think what you presented in Europe may resonate, in particular in some communities of expertise, like universities or also development experts. It may resonate as something which is a little bit away from current work that is being done today. I have 4 points. The first one is on your approach in terms of comparison, the use of China as the example or the model that you use to then compare with the possible development of fragile states. I'm not sure I understand or agree with your definition of inclusiveness in the case of China, and probably you didn't have enough time to dwell into the details of it. But I do have issues with China being presented as an inclusive model. So I would appreciate maybe some more elaboration on that. I'm pretty sure that comments on these parts of the book will feed you with enough material to write a second book on China alone. So how do you measure inclusiveness, and how can you be more precise? The second point is about the attitude you have regarding the fixing solution. For me, this is a bit of a problem. I think phrasing development questions as just a fixing question is indeed a bit dangerous, especially vis-à-vis certain audiences who are working hard and on a daily basis to improve their governance environments, their social context, and so on. So I would encourage you maybe to reflect on the usage of certain words. The third big question I had was about something I missed very much in your presentation, which is about the international dimension of state fragility. Not speaking of my reservations about the very concept of state fragility, that's something else. I miss, the international connections. I miss the examples of elites being internationalized already, connected with each other, being part of a certain international social class, actually. So maybe even to provoke you a little bit, to inject a bit of Marxist analysis in terms of the social classes confrontation, maybe would enrich the wealth of your thoughts on state fragility. But international dimensions are also related to not only the role of development agencies, but also of diplomacy, of individuals. And I had the impression that sometimes you looked at some fragile states in isolation. So maybe you may want to revise that. I mean, you asked for examples of experiences in perhaps fragile countries. I worked in Haiti, I worked on Chad, I worked in Georgia, which at some point also have been described as a fragile state. I worked on the former Soviet Union. So I hardly recognize my experience as a former, for instance, crisis group senior analyst on the ground, interviewing elites on a daily basis. I don't recognize myself in a lot of what you presented. So I would be very interested in keeping in touch and going on dialoguing about context. And my final point would be very much about the presentation itself, especially if you do it again in Europe. I would really recommend you to really focus on the context. You said, your book keeps on repeating that the context matters. But if context matters, do speak and focus on context. And engage your audiences on specific contexts in order to test your assumptions and see if they fly or not. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
One more question.
Yeah, I was just, do you want to ask something as well?
Yes.
Is it okay, Melanie, if I take you in the third round, because I know that some people have to leave, and then we go into a third round, and I will allow you the time to get responses.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you, Seth, for a comprehensive presentation. I see some of the reactions, which I think is very good. I would like to challenge you a bit on making the comparison not with China, but with current Europe and the United States. Because I think one of the great things about your analysis is it is not necessarily limited to developing countries. It's about exclusion, and exclusion happens in other states as well. And so maybe you can elaborate a bit on your views, how you compare that analysis with what's happening in the US.
Thanks also, Melanie.
Okay, so thank you. I'll make sure we'll get to that. Okay, so it's a very tall set of challenges you've given me. So I thank you for all the insightful questions. And obviously, in a very short talk, when I'm trying to condense so many things into a few words, I am missing a lot, and it comes out. So there's a lot more depth to the writing than the speaking. So I hope it's always better to read the book than go to the movie. From my own personal experience, I would argue that with some exceptions, there's some really good.
So there's also a movie.
Well, thank you. But anyway, so social cohesion. I think social cohesion is this will go back to the last question as well. Social cohesion is something that with globalization becomes even more important, because globalization and technology and the idea of the globalized elites disconnected from society and so on and so forth, all these things means that it becomes harder for countries to create this sense of togetherness, and harder for countries to have people who have the money and the power and and that are going to feel the responsibility to their communities. This is something that we're facing on a global level, a challenge not only, I think, as opposed to a few decades ago, everybody, if you ran a factory, your factory was part of that community. Today, if you run a factory, your factory might be part of the community in China, and you're just collecting the money. And so these are changes that affect everybody. So social cohesion, I think, matters more than ever. How do you create social cohesion? This is obviously easier in some places than others. I think there's a lot of practical things. Of course, leadership is so important. If Nelson Mandela, the idea of the Rainbow Coalition, or the rainbow identity of South Africa, there's a brilliant way to create a new identity. It hasn't been perfect. The new elites are in some ways a little similar to the old elites. Political culture carries over. But at least the 94 transition happened much better than anyone expected. And one reason was we created an identity that was inclusive. I'm thinking of Tanzania, where from day one there was a leader, maybe not the best at development, but used language and other instruments to create a togetherness, and there was an emphasis of running the country in a way that in neighboring Kenya, for example, has never been a high priority, where ethnic politics is so important. It becomes easier at critical points than it becomes later on when there's a large path dependence. But there's certainly many things that can be done. One powerful instrument, besides leadership, besides education, besides having programs that might encourage people or force people to get a stronger sense of nationhood, what we're really trying to do here is to create nations where there were no nations. Most of these countries are post-colonial. A great majority of fragile states are post-colonial, artificial countries that the people in the countries did not, through an evolutionary process, create, and therefore you need to compensate for that core defect in the country. I'm not here to talk about fixing and defects. I think my language was pointed out, may seem, but the point is a country is fragile because it wasn't created by the people. It was created by foreigners. The foreigners gave us this country, threw us together, left us institutions that have nothing to do with who we are, and now we're stuck with it. I mean, that is the starting point. And there's mistakes that have been made afterwards, but the starting point basically is that history. And once we understand this, that is the birth of fragility, is in the birth of the countries and how they came about. There are obviously exceptions. Botswana works better because by accident, it is not perfectly, but it is mostly a cohesive group that could build upon its history and its institutions, and it integrated the traditional with the modern, and it had good leaders and so on and so forth. Very few countries in the Middle East and Africa and even South Asia, you have this whole stretch, even Central Asia, where all the fragility has this as a starting point. So you have to do things. Another thing you do is media. Soap operas that bring together people from all parts of the country. All soap operas is one of the, I hate to give you a very mundane idea, but you want to change the way people think, change the soap operas that they watch. The values in the soap operas are so important, but it's also education, different programs that are nation building, some of the same things that we did in the 19th century in wealthy countries are not being done in many countries to create that encompassing identity. It's a hard topic. I do have more ideas in the chapter where I discuss that. So about cities, the point I want to make cities is, to some extent, this small is better, but it's actually something different. I believe that incentives for leaders are better in cities than they are in states because it's fewer divisions. It's easier to create institutions that bring people together. There's more social pressure on the leaders. And of course, there's cities that work better than others. But if the cities were more empowered, and then we focused on local taxation, which is easier in cities than states, and we focused on more accountability mechanisms, like besides elections, other things, I believe the cities have a greater chance to get out of the dysfunction than the states do. That is the key point I'm making, and then I'm explaining why, and I'm explaining the how. So Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, I agree completely, the context is very different. But I do believe that the element of leadership does matter. Of course, the incentives in the Cote d'Ivoire state, but Ghana, Jerry Rawlings could have come to power and been like every other autocrat, or most other autocrats. I shouldn't say every other autocrat. Compare Ghana to Equatorial Guinea, or to many other countries where there are autocratic leaders that don't feel a sense of responsibility to their country. Yes, he came to power with more power than Cote d'Ivoire. I agree with that. When you have to run an election and the only way you can win is based upon ethnic exclusion and you're tied to some patronage network and so on and so forth, it's very hard for a leader to come to power in Nigeria without having a strong patronage network and promising lots of people money. And if that $50 billion was also transparent and wisely used, a lot of people would have to have their head chopped off, so to speak, because there's a lot of people that depend upon things work in a certain way. And I realize the context is different, but Ghana did not have, because he came to power the way he did, he had more freedom. But he still chose a path that was different. And the question I'm only asking is, can leadership, and not just the top of the country, but leadership everywhere in the country. A country has thousands and depends on the scale of the country, as leaders. You have to have a certain background to be a leader. You can't be a poor person in a slum. You could be a leader, but it's much, much harder. But if you're given the chance to be a leader at different parts of a government, why does someone act differently to be inclusive, to create these institutions, to bring people together? That is the question I'm asking, really, in this case. Not that the context, I agree the contexts are different. I'm just using him as an example of someone who did make a difference when he had a chance. To go to the back of the room, China is not inclusive on some measures. It's not inclusive politically as we think of inclusiveness. It's not inclusive for the Tibetans, for sure, and some minorities. Of course, it's not a perfect case, but it did bring 600 million people out of poverty. So the leaders were inclusive, at least economically and socially, and to a certain extent, not by our definition, politically they were inclusive. And I don't take it as a perfect model. It's not my only model. I simply use it as an example. You could argue that any well-functioning democracy that allows everybody in the country relatively equal access to the rule of law, to the schools, to business opportunity is an inclusive country. The problem is I can't find many of those in the Middle East and Africa and even India. Do we think of India as an inclusive country? India is not an inclusive country at all. It's inclusive politically, as we're seeing with the elections, but in many ways it's much less inclusive than China. China is not a perfect model. Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, take any of these countries, there's an East Asian development model that is mostly not completely shared, and it is very different than the development model elsewhere, and neither is perfect, but let's be pragmatic and learn from both. That's basically what I'm trying to say here. Again, my use of terms, fiction is an awful term, I agree with that. The elite's international dimension, of course I agree with you. We have that even in the, why are there the rise of right-wing parties in Europe? Because a lot of people feel like the elites in their countries don't serve their countries, they serve the international elite. So there's people who are angry and frustrated everywhere because they feel that their leaders are more with this international elites. I would say more important than this social group international elites, there's certainly global incentives, the incentives that come from globalization that encourage elites to act the way they do that did not exist before. But one of the most important of them is that sovereignty is sacrosanct. And what that means is a country is a country is a country. And I don't argue for that change. It would be chaotic, but it used to be when a country wasn't well run, it would no longer be a country. And that is actually one of the biggest. And then if you're going to get aid to support you, that all in itself is a great incentive not to change. But I'm not arguing that it's very hard to change that because otherwise you have chaos. So, and a lot of people would suffer. And if I may just go to the last point, I think you're simply asking, Paul, is there some big difference between Europe and America in terms of inclusiveness and exclusiveness? Is this what you're asking? Well, if I may apply this, I like this framework because I think it tells us a lot about any country in the world. And I think, for example, in Brazil, a few decades ago, it was historically, for hundreds of years, a very exclusive model. And now the elites have changed their minds, and it's an example I use about how elites have, for many reasons, the elites act differently than they did before. Yes, the inequities are awful in this country, and the slums are the favelas are awful, but there has been, at least on some level, a change in attitude that we must do something, and they have programs like Bolsa Familia and what have you, and that's an example where elites change. So I think in the rich world, what we have this on different. See, in America and Europe, you have exclusion that are very different from each other. Actually, you have in both places. You have in Europe has a very hard time absorbing immigrants, even if, in terms of the government benefits, you're much more inclusive than we are. The integration of immigrants is much harder for you than it is for us, and that is more a social than it's more of an informal than a formal. It's something about our society. So in a sense, America on a social level is much more inclusive. But in terms of the policies of the government and the policies of the elites, you could argue that we're much more exclusive. And we have certainly an ideology that among a certain part of the population is that we should not be responsible for anybody, and they should just be left out. So it's a dynamic that plays out in different ways within our own countries. I don't know if that's what you wanted me to talk about.
Okay, we have a final round, if you agree with me, because we will go on until...
Also obligated to 2 o'clock, but if anyone wants to ask questions, I'm here for everybody. I'm here for you.
I had Melanie, I had Andrew.
Thank you, Paul. We'll be in touch. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
That's okay. Good luck at your meeting.
Yes. Please.
Thank you. Melanie Scoggins, Policy Advisor to the Belgian Ministry of Development Corporation. I have one question, but I will limit to 2. To what extent, it's a bit in the same sense as questions on globalization, but to what extent relatively new relations between specifically China and India also, and African countries are influencing and changing evolution without being planned in terms of development cooperation or being planned in terms of institutional support or something like that. That's one. The other one is on the development of cities. I think there are many challenging ideas, not only for developing countries, but also in the Western world. But what about people not living in those cities? I mean, there is a huge, especially in some developing countries, a huge difference between those people living in cities and those who do not. And you can't just bring them to the cities easily. I mean, what about their development? And just one more question.
Please, I'm here afterwards if you want to talk.
You were talking at the beginning of your presentation on corruption as not productive corruption. What do you mean with productive corruption? Just another question.
Good. Before anyone else leaves and before Andrew has the floor, I'm just mentioning this book is yours with 30% deduction. Very special. So this is a good incentive for you to stay. Andrew, and then I wasn't sure, Kathleen, whether you also wanted to ask a question about corruption, productive corruption. Yeah.
She's animating the next for the presentation. I have not read your book, so no challenges from my side, perhaps some enlightenment. I like the inclusive approach for development, the whole aspect of inclusion, the issue of context specific. I work for the national idea, so these are the things, the language that we like to hear. However, maybe if you have time, perhaps to just provide your perspectives. Things that I didn't hear, and I know it's a very limited presentation. The issue of young people, the youth, in terms of how do we build capacity there in order to govern one. Two, the issue of inequality. I think inequality is now on both sides of the Atlantic on the agenda. And I see equality as a vector for development. I just hear your views on that. And then just lastly, in terms of the development of cities, etc., how do you see that fit into a more regional perspective, where we have seen over the years that the Westphalian model of nation state is disintegrating a bit? Because I see also development as a side and an angle, and that's how I see development can be inclusive if it has also a regional perspective, because in some cases you have
many countries.
to have a sustained development, that it should have a regional element as well. So perhaps if you can just maybe, if you have time, highlight this.
That's okay. Anything else? Okay. So if I understood your first question, you want to know how China and India, how their approach to these countries, what are the implications of their approach? Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah. To what extent these relations are already or are challenging institutions in African countries, especially African countries?
Okay. I think China is easy to talk about, but they're both, both of these countries do not approach Africa the way the Western countries have approached Africa. They mainly, first of all, they come from a very different perspective. These are less developed countries that have many of the same problems, and are in some ways they're people. If we come from Brussels and we go to Kinshasa, what a shock, what a difference. If you go from Mumbai to Kinshasa, it's different, but it's not that different. You're more familiar, you're more comfortable. So that's good and bad. I would say these countries on a certain level have a great advantage because they're familiar with the problems, they're familiar with the ways of working. In some ways, their advice might be more relevant because they've dealt with many of the same issues not too long ago. Their approach in general is just get on with the business, just get on with things. I think there's a positive and there's a negative to their approach. And if you're looking specifically at institutions, the positive is to the extent that there's a positive momentum in terms of growth and that they spend some money on infrastructure and other things. This can only be a positive in terms of more people being included in the growth and eventually having some positive feedback on the institutions. The negative side, of course, is that they bring corrupt practices and they accentuate existing corrupt patterns. You're not helping institutions at all. I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, but basically for me there's a positive and negative, and it varies very much. This goes back to the globalization question. Globalization is a great force for change. Is it a positive driver of change or a negative driver of change? Depends upon the state. If you go to the DRC and China gives them a lot of money for some minerals and builds lots of roads and then builds factories and gets people jobs, there might be some corruption element, but it might be overall positive. They just take the minerals and give some people money and they run away. Of course, there's a very negative element. So again, it varies very much. But it goes back to the better the state is able to leverage China, the better the outcome will be, for sure. And the less able the state. All these things are accentuators of existing trends, in my opinion. So if a country is able to take advantage or not take advantage, China in some ways just makes it more of each. Have I answered your question okay? Because I'm not 100% sure exactly what you want me to say. Is that okay? Your second question on rural, when I talk about urban-based model, I'm not saying we ignore rural. I'm saying we empower cities more. And then I'm also saying someplace else in my book that the rural development is the starting point for the manufacturing development. And most poor people are in rural versus urban. So I'm not saying ignore rural at all. I'm just saying that the politics of a state are very hard to change, but the politics of a city, I see more hope. And doesn't mean that we do anything different in rural. But cities, and cities are also a regional element that encompassing the surrounding areas. This is not a whole country, but like if I was Kinshasa and its surrounding, what am I going to be? 20 million people in some rural area, and maybe that government would do better than the Congo would do, and so on and so forth. So I think that is, I'm not saying anything against rural. I think rural development has been the key in Indonesia, in China. All these countries started from the bottom up. So I'm not saying anything against that at all. I hope that wasn't confusion. Productive corruption has been a question. So I think corruption is very badly misunderstood in the development field. Corruption is not good, but it is not evil. Corruption, the word corruption in English means many, many different things. We all say, we have this Transparency International, and you look at their chart. I have a class I teach, so one of the parts of one of my classes is about corruption. And I have a reading I give students, and it refers to 3 different countries with 3 types of corruption. One is Korea, I think one is Zaire, or what the DRC is, and I think one was some middle case. And what you have in the DRC and Nigeria, you have is what I would call extremely destructive corruption. And what you have in most of East Asia is what I would call skimming, it's like a tax. So I pay, in China, you pay the 10%, the road gets built. In Nigeria, you pay everybody 10% and the road doesn't get built. And this is, and if I go to the Transparency International ratings, it's a little bit better now, but like Indonesia and Nigeria, they have the same result. And Cambodia has a worse result than most African countries. Yet Cambodia, it's not inclusive in many ways, but it has had 15 years of pretty good growth, and a lot of people have become wealthier, and yet, if you look at the corruption numbers, they're not the same. So there's a very different dynamic. I think it's naive to think that we can get money out of politics. I live in Washington. Washington is the one part of the United States that did not have a recession. There's it's the most highly educated part of the United States. It has high-tech companies, but obviously the reason is the federal government, and there's a lot of money involved in the federal government. The property prices went down a little bit. There was no recession. Nobody, I don't see a lot of people suffering. Money in politics. We're not going to get rid of money in politics. The question is, can we make the money in politics more productive? I think that is a more important question than an attempt to eliminate money in politics. I don't think it's possible. Where there is money, where there is politics with power and resources, and there's going to be money. The question is, can we turn that money into a more productive element? And I could go on and talk about lots of ideas for that. I think it's a little beyond the scope here, but I do have a section. If you want to make countries, to get started, you have to make the politicians have an incentive to help the business people. And there's good business people and there are bad business people. Business is needed for wealth creation. Business is required for development. I was in business and I did business in many poor countries. And was I always a good business person? Well, I can't say I was 100 out of 100, but hopefully I got to a 90 sometimes. But there were a lot of people who were doing business in a very destructive way, but the incentives were more for them than for me. Because if you don't do it that way, if I don't have a general on my board, it's very hard to do business in Nigeria. But the question is, can we create a mechanism where there's some productive activity? Yes, you get your 10%, but the factory gets built, and I'm not arguing that's easy to do, but we cannot ignore corruption, and we cannot wish it away. The question is, could it be used in a way where the net result was much better for the countries? And I think to the extent we always say awful, 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 we're not thinking creatively about the problem. Youth, if we want to be inclusive, youth is important in two ways. One is youth is the future. If you look at India and Africa, if you look at where are the poor people in the world, there are fewer and fewer poor people in East Asia. The future of poverty is South Asia and Africa. And India won, and Nigeria is about to become, if it's not already, the second largest number of poor people. More poor people in Nigeria than in China. Can you believe that? The population is such a difference. We're almost at that point. And India is going down a lot faster than Nigeria. And then you have a lot of the populations in Africa are going through the roof. There's going to be 400 million people in Nigeria. There's going to be the DRC and Ethiopia and Tanzania, the populations, Uganda, the populations are going to be enormous in the next few decades. And that is all about the youth. So the youth are two things. Youth is one thing is education. What we do today is we build schools very well. We don't do learning very well. If you're in Washington right now, one of the big topics that's being talked about in the few good development-oriented think tanks in Washington is learning. Everyone's talking learning right now. That we've got to get away from schools, we have to get to learning. If you look at the numbers out of most developing countries, including Brazil, including South Africa, countries that are much further developed than we're talking about Africa, South, and India, the education outcomes are awful. There's a lot of people in schools now that are not learning anything. And how do you change that? So if I had two things to talk about with youth, one is we have to change not the hardware of education, the software of, this goes back to my thing about the state. Until there's an education system, and this goes back is, you know, if you want to make a Ministry of Finance work good, it is relatively easy to do. And in the last 30 years, we go back 30 years, we had hyperinflation in many, many countries. We have no hyperinflation because central banks and Ministry of Finances are now pretty easy to run. Why? Because you don't need that many people. Try to get an education ministry or an agricultural ministry well run. Extremely hard to do because there's so many people. And it involves so many people that are not educated. You can run a Ministry of Finance at your bank. You have 5, 10, whatever, 50 people that have been educated in good schools, and you have a well-run ministry, and that's all you need. You're not going to run an education ministry with 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 people. You need a lot of people who can manage organizations and build incentives and have an inclusive attitude, and that is something no one has figured out how to do. That's the real problem in development. That's youth one. The second thing is, if we're not going to create jobs, the real problem in most of these countries is that most people, what's a job for most poor people? It's youth or not youth, running some small retail shop, hawking things on the street, the informal, maybe a small factory. It's all about informal. We don't, until South Asia and Africa can build the factories like East Asia, there are not going to be jobs for youth. We need economic transformation. We need factories galore. And we need rural development as well. I don't mean to ignore rural development, but when the rural area begins to develop, you have tens of millions of people that have no place to go if there's no jobs. And what you have in most of Africa and South Asia, you have these cities with lots and lots of people that have come off the farms, and the farms have made some progress, I would say not nearly enough, even in South Asia where they have made some progress, and you have a lot of people that are unemployed. So economic transformation is really the key to jobs. And I think inequality is important, but I specifically say, when I say social cohesion, horizontal, not vertical, because inequality is a product of a social system that is exclusive. So I do not look at inequality as an input. I look at inequality as an output of an existing institutional social system. And I'm looking at the horizontal to change that, and the institutional framework can change that, and then inequality will change. Inequality, for me, if you focus on that as an input, I don't agree with that. I know it's a very big thing in the development field. I think it's an outcome of the way things are, the structural issues, and we should not be focusing on that as an input, we should be focusing on it as an output. And if we don't change the other things, we're not going to change the inequality. And regionalism, when I talk about the city-based model, it actually is part of a chapter. I have a chapter on the idea of space, spatial dimensions of development. It's something that I never see, almost no one has talked about it. There's a couple of good books. There's a man named Jeffrey Herbst, who used to run the Africa Studies Department in Princeton, wrote really good books about power in Africa, and this is where I originally got some of the ideas. He talked about political geography of states and why they don't work. So in reality, I look at a few ways to change that. One of the ways is to go down. The other way is to go up. And I talk about West Africa, and I don't think specifically in West Africa, the countries are not large enough. There's not a big enough of a market. There's not enough capacity at the country level and market to make unless you're going to create infrastructure and capacity regionally, I cannot imagine West Africa many parts of West Africa becoming a highly dynamic, economically thriving economies because they're too cut off from the markets. You have a regional aspect that brings the countries together and integrated economies and allows people to immigrate as they want to immigrate, and maybe a regional capacity could help some of the problems with corruption and everything that are happening. I don't think you can really do things without regionalism, to be quite honest. And I am out of questions, I believe. And I thank you for staying an extensive period of time. I know we went over by 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, Seth, and thank you as an audience.
Very good questions, everybody. Very good questions. Thank you very much.
I enjoyed the interaction. For those who are interested in more, I have 4 more copies of the book. For the ECDPM folks, if you like, we have a follow-on meeting with Seth. And for those who want to chit-chat with Seth on the side, you can...
I'm here for everybody, that's why I'm here, yeah.
Yeah, and there is coffee in the room right there if for people who have time before going.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Is he tired from I wasn't sure that he said. Sorry, I think he was retired second. Jeremy disappeared, right?
Yeah.
What was he retired from? He said he was retired.
Oh, I